In garden sheds across Britain, the ghosts gather. Atco, Qualcast, Suffolk, Webb. Names that once ruled the British lawn, now little more than badges on foreign-built machines. Their factories silent, their craftsmen long gone. Yet in a quiet village in Hertfordshire, something impossible is still happening. Steel is still being cut, engines are still being tested, mowers are still rolling off a production line that has not stopped in 80 years. This is Hayter, born in 1946 from a second-hand two-stroke engine and a dustbin lid. Mower maker to the Queen, and now to the King. Still designed, still built, on British soil. Its own founder sold it. An American giant bought it. By every rule that killed its rivals, Hayter should have died with them. So why is it still here, when every great name beside it has turned to rust? Spellbrook, Hertfordshire. From 1946 to today, the story of the one factory that survived an entire industry's funeral. Long before the first blade of grass ever fell to a Hayter mower, there was a young man with grease under his fingernails and a mind that would not sit still. Douglas Hayter was born in 1914, and his love of machinery began in the most unglamorous way imaginable. Servicing aeroplane engines, learning how power was made, contained, and put to work. It was an education no classroom could give. By 1938, that knowledge had become a livelihood. He set up his own business near Bishop's Stortford in Hertfordshire, erecting workshops and sawmills, building for farmers, and making much of his own machinery by hand. When the war came, his talents were quietly conscripted. Hayter is said to have designed a top-secret device for the War Office, the details of which he kept to himself for the rest of his life. He was, in short, the sort of man who could not look at a problem without reaching for a tool. That instinct is what changed everything. In the years around the war's end, Hayter was clearing the long, coarse grass that grew up around the drying timber stacks of his yard. A friend lent him a cutter-bar mower for the task, and Hayter hated it. It was slow, clumsy, and exhausting, hacking at the grass rather than mastering it. Most men would have cursed the machine and carried on. Hayter went looking for a better idea. He found it, of all places, in a museum. On a visit to the London Science Museum, he stopped in front of a curious old exhibit, a horse-drawn rotary mower, a contraption whose spinning blade principle was already the best part of a century old. Where others saw a relic, the engineer saw a future. Rotary motion was the answer. It did not slice at grass like a pair of scissors. It cut on the move, fast and clean. All it needed was its own source of power. No horse, an engine. Back home in the village of Spellbrook, Hayter began to rummage. Under his workshop bench lay the usual hoard of an engineer's life. Odds and ends, salvage parts, a collection of bits kept just in case. Among them, he found a second-hand two-stroke engine. He bolted together a frame by hand from whatever would serve. And for the spinning blade beneath, the part that would do the cutting, and the part most likely to fling grass and stones in every direction, he reached for the most ordinary object in the yard, a dustbin lid. That battered metal lid, clamped over the rotor as a makeshift guard, sat at the very heart of the first Hayter rotary lawnmower. It was crude. It was improvised. There was nothing about it that looked like the future of British gardening. And yet, when he pulled the cord and the little two-stroke barked into life, it worked. Brilliantly. Where the borrowed cutter bar had floundered, Hayter's machine simply ate through the rough grass and left it neat behind. The man who had been forced to wrestle with someone else's tool now walked behind one of his own, and the difference was night and day. It was the moment an irritation became an invention. It did not stay his secret for long. Neighbors saw the strange little machine at work, and wanted one of their own. Friends asked. Then friends of friends. A man who had built it merely to spare himself an afternoon's misery suddenly found himself with a queue of customers and an idea far bigger than his timber yard. In 1946, he made it official. The business was incorporated as a limited company, no longer a builder who tinkered, but a manufacturer with a product the world did not yet know it needed. 100-year-old principle from a museum case, married to a scavenged engine and a dustbin lid, had become a company. But a single, hand-built machine in a Hertfordshire workshop is not yet an empire. To turn one clever contraption into a name spoken in over 100 countries, and, in time, into a royal warrant, Douglas Hayter would have to do something far harder than invent. He would have to manufacture, and the machine that would carry his name out of Spellbrook was about to be born. A clever machine can make one man's afternoon easier. Only a clever business can make one man's name last. In 1947, the year after the company was incorporated, the first Hayter motor scythe went into full production. And the dustbin lid prototype became something a customer could actually buy. It sold on its merits. Word of mouth had already proven the design. Now the orders came in earnest. But Hayter understood what many inventors never grasp. A single good machine is not enough. The market had needs he had not yet met, and an engineer's job was to meet them. So he built outward. For the men who maintained Britain's parks, orchards, and verges, Hayter developed heavy professional machines, rotary mowers with 5- and 6-foot cuts to clear orchard grass, a 6'6" tractor-mounted mower for the nation's roadside verges, and a self-propelled scythe that drove itself forward so the operator no longer had to shove. For the homeowner, lighter machines followed. One mower had become a range. The appeal of the rotary principle was no accident. The cylinder mowers that dominated British gardens cut like a pair of shears, beautiful on a billiard table lawn, but quick to choke and stall on anything longer or rougher. Hayter's spinning blade did not care. It could be taken to a neglected paddock, an orchard floor, or a council verge and simply mow, where a cylinder machine would jam within yards. That versatility won Hayter a customer base most rivals could not reach. Not only the careful suburban gardener, but the groundsman, the farmer, the parks department, and the contractor. Men who needed a machine that worked all day and asked few questions. The engineering matured alongside the company. The temperamental 2-stroke engine of the prototype gave way to a more reliable 4-stroke unit with a horizontal crankshaft. Steadier, longer-lived, better suited to a machine meant to serve for years rather than a single summer. The improvisation of the workshop was hardening into proper manufacturing, and manufacturing needs room. The modest premises at Spellbrook began to grow, the village workshop swelling towards a factory floor. What had begun as one man clearing his own timber yard was now a Hertfordshire employer, turning out machines for customers who would never meet him. Yet for all its growth, the company never lost the engineer's stubbornness it had been founded on. Build it properly, build it to last, and let the machine make the argument. By the dawn of the 1960s, Hayter was no longer a curiosity. It was a contender. A British mower maker with a hard-won reputation for machines that simply worked. But reputation, however good, is a quiet thing. What Hayter was about to receive would lift its name onto another level entirely. The kind of recognition that money cannot buy and that no rival can copy. In 1960, a recognition arrived that changed the company's standing forever. Hayter was granted a royal warrant, appointed supplier of horticultural equipment to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for the upkeep of the royal estate at Sandringham in Norfolk, It is difficult to overstate what this meant. A royal warrant is not bought, not won in a contest, and not given lightly. It is earned through years of consistent quality, granted only to firms that supply the royal household to its exacting satisfaction. For a company born in a village workshop barely a decade and a half earlier, to become the chosen mower of the monarch was extraordinary. Hayter would go on to hold that distinction as the sole supplier of lawnmowers to the British royal estate, a position it has never since surrendered. There could be no stronger endorsement in the land. A homeowner choosing a mower need read no review and trust no salesman. The same machines kept the lawns of the monarch, and that was argument enough. Quality had bought Hayter something its competitors could only envy. The crown was the seal. The world was the market. Through the 1960s, Hayter widened its reach and its range at once. It introduced the Ambassador, its first cylinder mower, stepping beyond the rotary machines that had made its name, and a 21-inch self-propelled model for the discerning gardener. To meet demand, the Spellbrook plant was enlarged again to some 25,000 square feet of working floor. Douglas Hayter built a network of distributors that stretched around the globe, and before long, his machines were being sold in more than 110 countries. The man who could not bear one slow afternoon's mowing was now exporting the cure to the world. Then, in 1970, came the machine that would become the company's signature, the Hayter Harrier, a rear roller mower whose weighted roller pressed the grass into the crisp, light and dark stripes that Britons came to regard as the very mark of a properly kept lawn. The same era brought the first Hayter ride-on, the bank rider, among the earliest rotary mowers to drive its cutting deck by hydraulic motor. The Harrier in particular struck a chord so deep that it remains in production to this day, more than half a century on. To own a Harrier was to be able to lay those stripes across one's own garden, the look of a cricket square or a stately lawn, brought within reach of an ordinary household. It was as much a piece of British identity as a piece of machinery. This was the summit of the Hayter that Douglas built, royal approval, a global trade, and a flagship machine that helped define the British lawn itself. And here, at the very top, is where the story ought to turn golden and stay that way. It does not, for while Hayter climbed, the entire industry around it, the great old names of the British lawn mower, was walking, one by one, towards a grave. Before long, Hayter would be asked whether it cared to dig its own. To understand how remarkable Hayter's survival truly is, one must first walk through the graveyard. For most of the 20th century, the British lawnmower was a point of national pride, and a handful of great names ruled it. None loomed larger than Atco. The story of Atco began not with grass, but with chains. The Atlas Chain Company had made its name forging chains for ships, but in the years after the First World War, one of the firm's mowing machines was being hauled around the works by a horse, until the horse dropped dead at its labor. Rather than buy another animal, the owner, Charles Pugh, built a mower that needed no horse at all, a petrol-engined machine, the first of its kind to be mass-produced anywhere in the world. It was a sensation. In 1921, the first year of production, just 900 Atco machines were built, each costing £75. No trifling sum in those days. Within 5 years, the figure had climbed to tens of thousands a year. The Atco standard put a powered mower within reach of the ordinary household and, in doing so, helped invent the very idea of the British weekend spent behind a mower, the smell of two-stroke and cut grass hanging over 1,000 suburban gardens. Atco was not merely a brand. For a time, it was the brand. It did not stand alone at the summit. From Derby came Qualcast, an iron-founding giant whose machines became a fixture of the suburban shed, and whose name was a household word. At its height, Qualcast employed some 5,000 people, a workforce on an industrial scale that a village firm like Hayter could scarcely conceive of. Alongside them stood Suffolk, whose Suffolk Punch became one of the best-loved cylinder mowers in the land, and Webb, another respected maker turning out machines for British lawns. These were not minor concerns. They were institutions. For decades, their cylinder mowers, the ones that cut with a spinning reel of blades and left the close, striped finish prized on every English lawn, were as much a part of the British summer as the cricket and the rain that interrupted it. A man might inherit his father's Qualcast, oil it, sharpen it, and hand it down again. The brands were stitched into the fabric of ordinary life, names trusted without a second thought, sold through every hardware shop and garden centre in the country. Together, these firms were the British lawnmower industry. They had history, scale, famous products, and the loyalty of millions of gardeners. They had been founded by Victorian and Edwardian engineers and had survived 2 world wars. If any companies in Britain looked unsinkable, it was surely these. But size is not the same as safety, and history is no defense against the future. The very things that made these firms mighty also made them slow. They were built around vast foundries and large workforces, around heavy cylinder mowers and decades-old ways of working. And from the 1970s onward, the ground beneath them began to shift. Cheaper machines arrived from overseas. New designs changed what buyers wanted, and the cost of running great industrial sites in Britain climbed year upon year. The giants were magnificent and dangerously rigid. When the squeeze came, they had a great deal to lose and very little room to move. And yet, within a single generation, almost every one of them would be gone, not bankrupted in one dramatic collapse. That, at least, would have been a clean death. Instead, they were slowly consumed, merged, sold, broken up, and finally hollowed out until nothing remained but the names on the bonnet. The undoing came not as a crash, but as a tide. It began with consolidation, the great names swallowing one another in the search for strength. Qualcast absorbed Suffolk's foundry in 1958, then took over Atco's maker, Charles H. Pugh, in 1965. 2 years later, Qualcast itself merged into a still larger group, Bermid Qualcast. The proud, independent firms of British lawn mowing were dissolving into one another, their once fierce identities reduced to product lines within ever bigger conglomerates. Each merger was sold as a strength. Each one, in truth, loosened a company's grip on the thing that had made it great: its own name, its own factory, its own way of doing things. Then came the blows. In the early hours of the 5th of November 1981, fire tore through the old Charles H. Pugh works, destroying the site and its stock. What survived of Atco was shifted away to Stowmarket in Suffolk. In 1988, the Bermid Qualcast Group was bought by Blue Circle, a cement company with no romance for mowers, which promptly sold off the foundry divisions for parts. In 1991, the historic Derby works closed altogether. The work carried east, the gates shut on a place that had employed thousands. A great industrial concern was being broken up and parcelled out, piece by piece, by men who saw it as a balance sheet rather than a heritage. The final indignity came from abroad. In 1995, what remained of Atco and Qualcast passed into the hands of the German engineering giant Robert Bosch. The last great independent British mower business was now foreign-owned. And foreign ownership in their case proved fatal to everything that had once made them British. Over the years that followed, the manufacturing was wound down and the value quietly extracted. By 2011, Bosch had sold off the tooling and the drawings for the entire mower range and licensed out the storied old names like so much surplus stock. The Atco brand handed to an Italian company, the Qualcast name leased to a high street shop. Today, a machine may still wear the name Atco, Qualcast, Suffolk, or Webb. But lift it, look closely, and you will likely find it was built in Italy or New Zealand, or wherever happened to be cheapest that year. A machine designed by strangers, dressed in a dead rival's clothes, sold to gardeners who remember the name and assume it still means what it once did. To the enthusiasts who had grown up with these mowers, it felt like a betrayal, a heritage not lost in honest competition, but quietly asset stripped, the badges sold off while the workshops fell silent. The names survived. The companies that earned them did not. This was the world in which Hayter operated, an entire industry quietly eating itself, its proudest names becoming little more than stickers on imported machines. The tide that had drowned Atco and Qualcast was still rising, and there was no earthly reason to believe that a small family firm in a Hertfordshire village would be spared it. Hayter had the royal warrant. Hayter had the Harrier. But it also had a founder who was no longer a young man, and a future that somebody would soon have to decide. In 1985, that decision was made, and the man who made it was Douglas Hayter himself. Every family firm, if it lives long enough, arrives at the same crossroads. The founder who poured his life into the business grows old, and the question that has no easy answer must finally be faced. What becomes of the company when the man who is the company can no longer run it? By the mid-1980s, Douglas Hayter had reached that crossroads. The young engineer who had once bolted a dustbin lid over a spinning blade was now past 70. He had built something extraordinary, a firm with a royal warrant, a global trade, and a flagship mower beloved the length of Britain. But a business is not a machine. It cannot simply be left running on the bench. It needs owners, capital, and a plan for the years after its founder is gone. And Douglas Hayter had a decision to make. It is the cruelest arithmetic an inventor ever faces. A man can spend 40 years building something with his own hands, only to discover that the one thing he cannot build is its future without him. Children may not wish to take it on. Markets change faster than a single lifetime can follow, and a firm starved of investment will wither, however fine its product, while a firm sold to the right backer might outlive its founder by generations. To hold on can be as dangerous as to let go. In 1985, he made his choice. He sold the company. Precisely why he chose to sell, and on exactly what terms, is not something the public record lays out in detail. What is certain is the kind of buyer he sold to, and that detail tells a story of its own. The purchaser was F. H. Tompkins. H. Tompkins was not a gardening company. It was not, in any meaningful sense, even an engineering company with a fondness for mowers. It had begun decades earlier as a humble maker of buckles and fasteners, and by the 1980s, it had remade itself into something very much of its era. A financial conglomerate, driven by a new and aggressive leadership that had learned its trade in the world of corporate takeovers. Its model was not to make things, but to buy the firms that made them, to assemble, through a relentless run of acquisitions, an empire of unrelated businesses held together by nothing warmer than ownership. Into that empire, in 1985, went Hayter. It was an early prize in a buying spree that would, in the years ahead, swell the conglomerate into a sprawling giant of utterly unrelated trades. The men running it did not need to understand grass, or rotary blades, or the particular pride of a groundsman in a well-struck stripe. They needed the numbers to work. That was the whole of the philosophy. Do not learn the craft. buy the firm that already has it and judge it ever after by what it returns. Consider the distance traveled. A machine improvised from spare parts under a workshop bench had become a line on an investor's ledger. The firm that had earned the trust of the monarch through patient craftsmanship was now owned by people who, in all likelihood, had never once pushed a mower across a lawn. The founder had stepped back. The accountants had stepped in. It was exactly the kind of moment from which so many great British names never recovered. And the danger was not merely symbolic. In the years that followed its purchase of Hayter, the conglomerate kept buying. Among the many businesses it gathered in were two especially telling names: Smith & Wesson, the American gun maker, and Murray, a mass-market American manufacturer of lawnmowers. And so, the careful, premium, royal-warranted maker of striping mowers from a Hertfordshire village found itself sitting in the same portfolio as a budget mower giant from across the Atlantic and a maker of firearms. All of them bolted together not by any shared craft, but by the cold logic of capital. This was the precise pattern that had hollowed out the rest of the industry. Recall what had befallen Atco and Qualcast. Proud independent firms absorbed into larger groups, their decisions handed to owners who measured everything by the balance sheet. Their factories eventually judged surplus to requirements. A small premium brand inside a vast conglomerate is a fragile thing. If the sums stop adding up, it can be cut, merged, or quietly shifted to wherever labor comes cheaper, and its name simply pressed onto a machine built somewhere else entirely. By every rule the age had written, Hayter was now a candidate for exactly that fate. It had a famous name, a devoted following, and a modest factory in an expensive country. The perfect ingredients for a brand to be rationalized. The men who now owned it owed it no sentiment. To them, Spellbrook was a site, the Harrier was a product line, and the Royal Warrant was a marketing asset. Sitting beside the Murray name, Hayter could so easily have been the one quietly wound down, its work handed to a cheaper American cousin, its village left with an empty shed and a memory. Nor was the conglomerate itself a stable harbour. The kind of company built by acquisition is rarely built to last. It grows, reshapes, sheds divisions, and changes hands as the market and its masters demand. A small mower firm in Hertfordshire was always going to be a passenger on someone else's voyage, with no say in where the ship was steered or when it might be sold again. Independence, once given up, is not easily got back. And yet, something about Hayter resisted. Selling the company had not meant abandoning it. The firm kept its name, kept its Spellbrook factory, and kept building the machines that had made it. And here lay the quiet genius of the position Douglas had built. Hayter was not a cheap brand fighting on price, where any factory in any country could undercut it. It was a premium one, and its value lived entirely in its reputation for quality. The very thing that cannot be outsourced, faked, or knocked out at a discount. A budget mark like Murray could be moved anywhere a cheaper line ran. But to move Hayter, to cut its corners, would have been to dissolve the only asset that made it worth a penny. The quality that had won the favour of the Crown was, paradoxically, the company's armour. For now at least, the dustbin lid principle still held its ground. Build it properly, and let the machine make the argument. But surviving one set of corporate owners is not the same as surviving forever. The conglomerate that bought Hayter would not hold it forever, and the man who founded it would not be there forever either. The 1990s would test the company in both ways at once, and at the close of the decade, Hayter would lose the one person who had been with it since the very beginning. The 1990s should, by every reasonable expectation, have been the decade that finished Hayter off. All around it, the old world of British lawn mowing was being broken up and carried abroad, the famous names of a century passing one after another out of British hands. A small premium firm, owned by a conglomerate with no particular love of mowers, sitting in a portfolio beside an American budget rival, had every reason to expect the same quiet ending that was claiming everyone else. Instead, Hayter did something deceptively simple. It kept its head down, and it kept making mowers well. It was not an easy time to be a quality manufacturer. The 1990s were the decade in which the cheap, disposable mower came of age. Light machines, often built far from Britain, sold for a fraction of the price of a proper one and designed to be thrown away rather than repaired. For a firm that built heavy, lasting, expensive machines in an expensive country, this was an existential squeeze. The obvious response, the one the accountants of the world tend to favor, would have been to chase the bottom, cut the cost, cut the quality, move the work somewhere cheaper, and compete on price. It is precisely the path that ended the rivals. Hayter refused to take it. The proof of that refusal came in the form of a most unglamorous honor. At some point in that decade, Hayter built its 1 millionth mower fitted with a Briggs & Stratton engine, and the great American engine maker presented the company with an award to mark the achievement. It is the sort of milestone that wins no headlines, but read it closely and it tells you almost everything. 1 million machines. Not 1 million units dumped in a fire sale, but 1 million mowers built, one after another, to a standard reliable enough that the world's largest maker of small engines wanted its own name tied to the feet. While its rivals were being measured for their breakup value, Hayter was being measured by the sheer patient weight of what it produced. And there was real substance behind the milestone. In 1996, the company reached its 50th year, its golden jubilee, and marked the occasion as a maker confident in its future tends to, with a special jubilee range of machines. That same year, it looked forward rather than back, producing an early battery-powered version of the Harrier 41. A glimpse, decades ahead of the crowd, of the cordless future that would one day reshape the entire industry. This was not a company being quietly steered towards the grave. This was a company innovating, celebrating, and building by the million, in the very years its proudest competitors were being dismantled around it. Whatever the men in the distant boardroom made of it, the factory at Spellbrook simply carried on doing the thing Douglas Hayter had taught it to do. There is a lesson buried in that decade, and it is the heart of the whole Hayter story. When the storm came, the giants tried to survive by becoming cheaper, bigger, more like everyone else. And in doing so, they surrendered the only things that had ever made them worth choosing. Hayter survived by the opposite instinct, by becoming more itself. It did not flinch from being expensive, British, and built to last. In a market racing to the bottom, it simply refused to run the race. And that refusal would cost it volume and tempt fate more than once. But it was also the only reason there would still be a Hayter to fight for when the truly decisive hour arrived. And Douglas Hayter was still there to see it. He had sold the company in 1985, but he had never truly left it behind. He had settled with his wife in the area, remained a figure of real standing in the towns and villages around Spellbrook, and kept a hand and a heart in the business that still bore his name. The man who had built a mower from a dustbin lid had become a local institution in his own right, living proof that a man may give up the ownership of a thing without ever surrendering his love for it. In the year 2000, Douglas Hayter died. He was in his mid-80s. It is worth pausing on what he had lived to see. He had been born in 1914 into a Britain where machinery was still drawn by horses. He died in a Britain whose lawns were striped by machines bearing his name and sold in more than 100 countries. He had watched his own idea grow from a one-off contraption under a workshop bench into the chosen mower of the monarch. And this is the part that matters most. He had lived just long enough to watch his company survive the very decade that destroyed almost every rival it had ever had. He left behind not merely a business, but a kind of proof that quality, stubbornly maintained, could outlast the cleverest financial fashions of the age. But the founder's death left a question hanging in the air, and there was no one left who could truly answer it. For as long as Douglas Hayter lived, there had been a kind of moral anchor to the whole enterprise, a living link back to the workshop, the dustbin lid, the original promise to build things properly. While he was alive, even distant owners could feel they were custodians of something with a soul. With him gone, that link was severed. Hayter was now, more nakedly than ever, simply an asset, a valuable name and a working factory, held by a conglomerate that bought and sold businesses as coolly as the markets demanded. Such groups do not keep what no longer fits the plan. Sooner or later, the decision would be taken that Hayter was surplus to the portfolio. Sooner or later, the company would be put up for sale. This is the quiet terror of the survival story, the part the triumphant histories leave out. Hayter had not won anything permanent. It had simply not yet lost. Every decade it endured only delivered it to the next decade's danger. It had survived the death of its industry and the death of its founder. But it remained, at the dawn of the new century, a small British factory whose fate lay entirely in other people's hands, waiting for a sale it could neither prevent nor control. The only open question was whether that sale, when it came, would be its salvation or its execution. And when that day came, everything Douglas Hayter had built would hang on a single question. Who would buy it? And what would they choose to do with it? Would the next owner be a custodian or an undertaker? The answer arrived in February 2005 from 3,000 miles away, and it would prove to be the single most dangerous moment in Hayter's entire history. By the early years of the new century, the end of Hayter's long limbo finally arrived. The conglomerate that owned it had, over the years, transformed itself yet again, turning away from consumer goods and towards heavy industrial and automotive engineering on a global scale. In a portfolio being rebuilt around hoses, belts, and industrial systems, a small maker of garden mowers in a Hertfordshire village was an obvious misfit. It was time, the owners decided, to sell. And so Hayter was put on the market, arriving at the very moment the whole story had been building towards and dreading. The buyer, when it emerged, was precisely the kind that British industrial history had taught the nation to fear. It was American, it was enormous, and it made lawn mowers. The Toro Company was, and remains, a giant of the turf world. Founded back in 1914 and based in Bloomington, Minnesota, it commanded annual sales of around $1.6 billion, and he owned a whole stable of well-known mowing and irrigation brands. Its machines tended the playing surfaces of stadiums and the fairways of golf courses across the globe. Against Toro, the little factory at Spellbrook was a minnow, and on the 9th of February 2005, Toro announced to the world that it had swallowed it. The Toro Company had acquired the assets of Hayter Limited. To anyone who knew the recent history of British manufacturing, the announcement read like a death notice. For this was the script that had played out again and again across industry after industry, and most painfully of all within lawn mowing itself. A proud British name and a famous old factory are bought by a far larger foreign corporation. There are warm words about synergy and growth and opportunity, and then, quietly, over the years that follow, the cold logic of the spreadsheet asserts itself. The expensive British plant is judged surplus. Production is moved abroad to wherever it can be done more cheaply. The workforce is let go. And the storied old name lives on only as a badge, stuck to a machine built thousands of miles from the place that made it famous. Hayter's own dead rivals were the textbook example of exactly this. Now here was Hayter, a small, expensive, stubbornly British operation, bought by an American multinational with large factories of its own across the Atlantic. Every precedent pointed in one direction. Toro had its own plants, its own mass production, its own established way of doing things. Why on earth would it go on paying British wages to build mowers in a cramped Hertfordshire village, when it could simply take the famous Hayter name, fold the best designs into its existing factories, and quietly shut Spellbrook down? And this was not an abstract worry on a balance sheet. It was the livelihoods of the men and women who clocked in at Spellbrook each morning. Engineers, welders, assemblers, families whose wages and pensions and futures were tied to that one factory, in a village where Hayter had been the name for the best part of 60 years. They had watched the same thing happen elsewhere. They knew exactly what an American takeover could mean. A few uncertain years, a soothing statement or two, and then a letter explaining that the work was moving and their services were no longer required. For the people of Spellbrook, the press release from Minnesota was not industry news. It was a question mark hanging over the kitchen table. By every rule the previous 50 years had written, this was the moment Hayter died. The founder was gone. The independence was long gone. And now the company belonged, body and soul, to a corporation 3,000 miles away that owed Spellbrook precisely nothing. This was the true crucible of the whole story. More dangerous in its way than the sale of 1985. Selling to the conglomerate had at least kept Hayter on British soil, one small brand among many. But to be absorbed by a foreign mower giant with its own factories was to hand the company to the one kind of owner that had every rational reason to close it down. Hayter had no leverage, no founder to plead its case, no vote in the matter. Its fate rested entirely in the hands of strangers in Minnesota. The funeral notices were, in effect, already written, and then they had to be torn up. Because Toro, as it turned out, had not come to bury Hayter. It had come to keep it. Read the actual terms of the 2005 agreement, and a quite different story emerges from the one all the precedents predicted. Toro had not merely bought the Hayter name and its drawings. It had acquired the operating assets, the intellectual property, and the words that mattered most of all, the manufacturing operations and approximately 200 employees, all of which were to continue operating under the Hayter name. The managing director, Derek Bolton, would stay on to run the company. This was not the purchase of a brand to be hollowed out at leisure. It was the purchase of a working business that was meant to go on working. Nor was Hayter some distressed wreck being picked over for scrap. In 2004, the year before the sale, the company had turned over around £26 million. This was a real, functioning, respected manufacturer. And Toro was buying it precisely because of what it already was, not in spite of it. To understand why Toro behaved so differently from the conglomerate and the asset strippers who had gone before, one need only understand what Toro itself was. It was not a financial holding company flipping businesses for a quick return. It was a maker, an engineering firm almost a century old, built like Hayter, on a hard-won reputation for well-made, dependable machines, with a family of respected brands it had grown rather than gutted. When Toro looked at Hayter, it did not see merely a name to be cheapened and a factory to be closed. It saw engineering, manufacturing knowledge, skilled people, and a culture of quality that closely mirrored its own. Its leadership spoke of the United Kingdom as an important turf market, and of Hayter as a business whose commitment to product excellence matched theirs. That, in the end, is the whole difference. The quiet hinge on which this entire story turns. To an owner who reads only the balance sheet, a small premium factory is a cost to be eliminated. To a fellow manufacturer who understands what such a factory actually is, it is a capability to be protected. The men who had hollowed out Atco and Qualcast were money men, and they treated Mower works as line items. The company that bought Hayter was a mower maker, and it knew the one thing the money men never grasped, that you cannot fake 80 years of accumulated engineering, and you certainly cannot buy it back once it has been thrown away. There was evidence, too, that this was simply how Toro operated. It already carried within it a clutch of acquired names. Among them, long-established American marques it had taken on and kept alive rather than crushed into a single house brand. Toro understood the value of a distinct name with a loyal following, because it had built much of its own success on exactly that. To it, Hayter was not a competitor to be neutralized, but an addition to be nurtured. The British arm of a turf empire, carrying a royal warrant no American factory could ever earn. So the nightmare simply did not come. The brand was not reduced to a sticker. The factory was not closed. The work was not shipped overseas. Against almost every precedent in modern British manufacturing, the American buyer chose to be a custodian rather than an undertaker. But here a skeptic might reasonably interrupt. Press releases, after all, are cheap. Warm words about heritage and quality are exactly what every doomed acquisition is wrapped in. Promises made on the bright morning of a takeover have a notorious way of evaporating in the grey years that follow, once the accountants get to work, and the headlines have long since moved on. So the real question was never what Toro said in February 2005. It was what Toro would actually do. Not for 1 year, but for a decade, and then for 2. Would the metal still be cut in Spellbrook? Would the line still run? Would Hayter, 20 years on, still be Hayter in any sense that mattered? Or just another fond memory under a foreign flag? The answer can be seen by anyone willing to walk through the factory doors today. And it is the most remarkable part of the entire story. Spellbrook is a small village in the Hertfordshire countryside, a short way from Bishop's Stortford. There is not a great deal to it, but on its edge stands a factory. And it stands, remarkably, on the very same site where Douglas Hayter built his first machines in 1946. Nearly 80 years on, the company has never moved. The address has not changed, and neither, in the ways that truly matter, has the work. Step inside, and the noise tells the story before anything else can. This is not the hush of a showroom, nor the reverent silence of a museum. It is a working factory, loud with the honest business of making things, the whine of cutting machinery, the hiss and sharp crack of welding, the steady clatter of a production line in motion, the thump of finished machines being boxed for the road. Roughly 15,000 mowers leave this building every year, not assembled from kits shipped in from abroad and merely badged here, made, designed, engineered and built on this spot in Hertfordshire. It begins, as all metalwork must, with raw steel. Flat sheets of it arrive at the factory and are fed to the laser cutters, where a beam of light traces out each component with a precision Douglas Hayter could only have dreamed of. Slicing the shapes of decks and frames and brackets from the metal cleanly and exactly, with none of the hammer and file labor of the old workshop. From the cutters the parts pass to the welders, where skilled hands and showers of blue-white sparks fuse them into the strong, rigid structures that will one day have to survive years of being shoved across rough British lawns. Then comes the paintwork, the components cleaned, coated and cured into that familiar, hard-wearing finish, ready at last to carry the Hayter name. There is a deep continuity running through all of this that is easy to overlook. The tools have changed beyond all recognition. The laser cutter would have struck the man with the dustbin lid as something close to magic, but the principle threaded through the place is exactly the one he laid down in his workshop all those years ago. Take honest materials, work them properly, and build a thing that lasts. The machines that shape the steel are new. The standard they are held to is not. It is the same standard that once won the favor of a queen, passed down the decades like a tool worn smooth by use. And it is people who carry that standard, not machines. A laser can cut a panel, but it takes a trained eye and a practiced hand to judge a weld, to fit a part, to know when something is right and when it is very nearly right, which in a Hayter is not the same thing at all. The factory runs on skilled labor, engineers, fabricators, assemblers, many of them local, some of them with years or even decades behind them on that same floor. In an age when Made in Britain has so often dwindled to a marketing line printed on goods assembled elsewhere, here the phrase still means precisely what it says. British hands on British soil, building a British machine from raw steel to finished mower. It is an increasingly rare sight and all the more striking for it. And this is the answer, made physical, to the question left hanging at the takeover. The line did not fall silent. The work was not carried across the Atlantic to some cheaper plant. 20 years after an American giant bought the company, the steel is still being cut, welded and painted in the same Hertfordshire village where it has always been done. And then, on the assembly line, the mower finally takes shape. Down the line, the painted components travel, and at each station, a little more of the machine comes together. The engine mounted, the cutting deck married to the body, the wheels, the handle, the controls, and, on the flagship models, that signature heavy rear roller fitted into place. For at the very heart of the modern Hayter range still sits the Harrier, the rear roller striping mower, first launched in 1970, and more than half a century later, still the machine the company is best known for. It has been refined and reworked many times across the decades, but its essential idea, a quality British mower that lays a crisp, professional stripe across an ordinary garden, has never been bettered and never been let go. Nothing leaves the building without being proven. Each finished mower is taken to a testing area and actually run, checked that it starts, that it cuts, that it does everything a Hayter is supposed to do, before it is ever allowed to wear the badge in earnest. Only then is it boxed, loaded and dispatched. And from this one small village, the machines go out across the entire United Kingdom and Ireland, from Inverness in the far north of Scotland to Penzance at the very toe of Cornwall, to the homes and gardens, the estates, the parks, and the playing fields the length and breadth of the land. And among the lawns they keep are still the grandest in the country. The royal warrant that Hayter first earned in 1960 has never once lapsed. Through reign after reign it has been renewed, and today the company holds it under His Majesty King Charles III, still the sole supplier of lawn mowers to the royal estate, the honour carried forward into a new reign and secured for years yet to come. 80 years on, a Hayter still cuts the king's grass, exactly as it once cut the queen's. Of all the things an American factory might buy, that is the one it never could. You cannot manufacture a century of royal trust. Nor has the company stood still and simply lived off its past. As the world turns towards quieter, cleaner machines, Hayter has embraced battery power, building cordless mowers for a new generation of gardeners who want the stripe without the petrol and the fumes. Picking up, in the present day, the very thread the firm first reached for back in the 1990s. Stand on that factory floor and take in what it represents. This is not nostalgia. It is not a heritage display, nor a famous old name kept breathing on a marketing budget. It is a living, working production line, turning out 15,000 real machines every year in the same place, under the same name, to the same exacting standard, for the best part of 100 years. Atco's works are gone. Qualcast's great foundry is gone. Suffolk and Webb are gone, or shrunk to names printed on the side of somebody else's machine. But the line at Spellbrook is still running. The lights are still on. The metal is still warm. Pause on how improbable that is. Everything in the previous half-century said this factory should be a car park or a housing estate by now, its name a label on an imported box, its workers long since scattered. The death of its industry, the loss of its founder, the sale to a conglomerate, the takeover by a foreign giant. Any one of those blows had finished off firms far larger and far older than Hayter. It absorbed all of them, one after another, and it is still here. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a noisy, busy, profitable factory, full of people building mowers. In the whole long funeral of British lawn mowing, this is the one mourner who walked out of the churchyard and went back to work. And that leaves only the deepest question of all, the one this entire story has been circling from the very first frame. Why this one? Why, of all the proud names of the British lawn, did Hayter alone survive? The answer is the lesson Douglas Hayter left behind him, and it is worth understanding closely, because it reaches very far beyond the cutting of grass. So why did Hayter live? Strip the story to its core, and the answer comes down to a handful of plain truths. And the first is the hardest for any business to accept. Hayter survived because it refused to compete on price, while its rivals chased volume, cut their corners and strained to be cheaper than the next machine on the shelf. Hayter stayed expensive, stayed British, and staked everything on simply being better. In a market racing to the bottom is precisely where most of the racers ended up. Hayter ran the other way and discovered that quality, unlike cheapness, cannot simply be undercut. A premium reputation became the one wall its competitors could not climb, and its owners could not afford to knock down. The second truth is more uncomfortable, because it is partly a matter of fortune. Hayter survived its foreign takeover not because foreign ownership is harmless. Its dead rivals are proof enough that it is often fatal, but because of who, exactly, did the buying. The fate of a company sold over its workers' heads rests entirely on the character of the buyer. A financial owner sees a brand to strip and a factory to shut. A fellow maker sees a capability to protect. Hayter had the misfortune to be sold, and the rare good fortune to be sold to a craftsman rather than a wrecker. That single distinction, custodian or undertaker, decided everything that followed. The third truth is the simplest of all, and it runs straight back to a dustbin lid in a Hertfordshire workshop. The giants died trying to become like everyone else. Hayter lived by stubbornly remaining itself. Through every change of owner, every turn of the market, every temptation to cheapen the product and follow the crowd, it held fast to the one principle its founder had handed it: build it properly and let the machine make the argument. That was never mere nostalgia. It was strategy, and, as it turned out, the only strategy that worked. There is something in that worth carrying out of the garden and into everything else. The lesson of Hayter is not really about lawnmowers. It is about what survives when the easy money, the cheap shortcut, and the clever financial fashion have all had their turn. The thing made honestly by people who care, to a standard they will not lower. Trends pass, conglomerates rise and fall, but a reputation for doing something properly is the slowest thing in the world to build, and it turns out, the hardest of all to kill. The country has begun to notice. In 2026, Hayter reaches its 80th year, 8 unbroken decades of manufacturing on a single Hertfordshire site, a span that has outlasted whole industries. Its factory has been thrown open to the cameras of national television. Its production line walked and marvelled at as one of the last places in Britain where such a thing is still genuinely done. And the man who began it all has not been forgotten. A blue plaque now honours Douglas Hayter, the builder and engineer who glimpsed a 100-year-old idea in a museum case and turned it, with a scrap engine and a bin lid, into a company that would outlive him by generations. The grass still grows, the stripes are still laid, and in a quiet village where almost everything said it should not be, a British mower is still built by British hands, the lone survivor of an entire vanished world, still running long after the funeral has ended and the mourners have gone home. If this story moved you, then the next time you pass a crisply striped lawn, glance at the badge on the mower and remember what it took for that one name to survive when all the others fell. And if you would like more forgotten stories of the factories that built and lost Great Britain, please like this video and subscribe so that the next one finds its way to you.